Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis. When the Defense Department announced plans to close Fort Monroe, 2011 seemed a long way off, but it is really right around the corner. And tonight we'll consider how the plans are progressing, what's still being debated, how the economy may affect the vision, and many other issues as well. One issue that's emerged is a vision for Fort Monroe as a site that has a story to tell about slavery in America. Lisa Godley reports it's an issue front and center for those who want to see the fort turned into a national park.
As the clock winds down on Fort Monroe's time as an active Army base, work is underway to transform the fort's 570 acres into a major tourist destination. William Armbruster heads up the Fort Monroe Federal Area Development Authority, or FADA, the group tasked with preserving the fort's history while making it economically self-sustaining.
Our intent is to maintain this historic place, keep its historic legacy intact, but we want to open it up, share it with the citizens, not just simply Army families and Army officials.
The fort's place in history cannot be denied. Not only has it been around for hundreds of years, but has housed famous Americans like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. The fort was built in 1819 on Old Point Comfort in what is now part of the city of Hampton. Its original mission was to protect Hampton roads from enemy attacks. To ensure that, Fort Monroe was armed with the most powerful artillery of that time, guns that could fire over a mile away. During the Civil War, Fort Monroe was the place where Major General Benjamin Butler refused to return escaped slaves to bondage, calling them contraband of war and giving thousands of slaves a place to seek their freedom. Fort Monroe was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1960.
But we want to open it up for all of our citizens to enjoy this beautiful place. We want to have them come in and enjoy the open space, the parks, the beaches, hiking, biking, kayaking on Mill Creek.
Armbruster says even before the Army formally transfers the property to the Commonwealth of Virginia in 2011, FADA wants to begin leasing some of the fort's beautiful homes to private citizens. FADA also wants to do some development, but Armbruster says it will be very carefully controlled.
We're standing inside the moat, and this is the most historic part of Fort Monroe. There will be no new construction in this area. What you see will be maintained. These are all on the historic register, so we'll look at adaptive reuse for all of these buildings.
Armbruster goes on to say that outside the moat, they're looking to build a resort hotel, expand the marina, and add beach and camping amenities, as well as museums. But the Vice President of Citizens for a Fort Monroe National Park does not believe development outside the moated fortress is necessary to make Fort Monroe self-sustaining.
Even if it weren't important historically, it's still an environmental and recreational gem in an area where we don't have enough access to the waterfront. We like to call it the endangered green heart of Fort Monroe.
Steve Corneliuson says all of Old Point Comfort is a national treasure with international significance.
That's the land that gives the setting to the moated fortress. That's the land that shows it in its historical significance. And we think that that land ought potentially to become mostly green space, not development space.
Both those for and against development on Old Point Comfort agree that it will cost about $7 million a year to maintain the property. Armbruster says after about 8 years, Fort Monroe should start generating money. It's also believed that once Fort Monroe opens to the public, it will draw at least 250,000 visitors a year. For What Matters, I'm Lisa Godley.
And joining us tonight to talk about the future of Fort Monroe are Bill Armbruster, who's the Executive Director of the Fort Monroe Federal Area Development Authority, and Mark Perot, who is President for Citizens for a Fort Monroe National Park. Welcome to both of you, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
When we look at this gem that is Fort Monroe, that's the one thing I think both of you would probably agree on, is that we really are talking about something that is just unique and marvelous in American history.
There's no question it is a grand place. 400 years of history out there. tremendous story to tell. We're about protecting that we both share the same goal for that.
So where are we in the process? You know, we note that 2011, and we said at the top of the show, boy, and you all probably feel that way too, seemed like a long way off, and here it is.
927 days.
Not that anybody's counting, right? So where are we in the process? Because the fort will be turned over to the Commonwealth, is that right?
That's correct. We have finished the planning with submission of our formal reuse plan to the Department of Defense and the Housing and Urban Development Department as required by the BRAC process. We are now in the middle of transitioning from the planning process into implementing the plan. Now, the reuse plan itself is a concept or a vision document. It is supported by additional text through the technical manual, and that's the living part of the implementation plan that we're doing now. So we're continuing to refine, work the numbers, do the economic analysis to indicate the direction that we need to go. But we're shifting from a planning process now into the implementation plan.
And there are still some questions to think through on that process. Mark Perot, welcome and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Kathy.
What does your organization have a concern about when it comes to this issue of design and then implementation? Where do you part company with this plan, the Fort Monroe reuse plan that's been developed?
Well, to start with, there's a lot we like in the reuse plan, and that reuse plan is miles better than the reuse plan that was first developed in 2006, which would basically planned up to 2,500 housing units new housing units on Fort Monroe. But the plan itself, as Bill said, is very conceptual, and there's a lot of gaps in it yet to be filled. One of them, Steve Corneliuson already referred to, is the Wary Quarter, which the endangered green heart of Fort Monroe, whose status is undetermined and is being planned for cleanup to allow development to occur there. We think it should remain mostly green space, and that part of the plan needs to be clarified.
And this area that we're talking about, just to be clear, if I understand it, is a barrier between the green space and the historic area. Is that right?
Well, that's what we're afraid it will become. It's about 100 acres in between.
But you would like to see that remain green space as well?
Mostly, yeah. So that there's a connection for the visitor, local visitors, residents, tourists, between the historic area, which is magnificent, and the green space and the beaches, which in themselves are magnificent, and make the whole thing work together and in the public's mind as one fantastic treasure for Hampton Roads and the nation.
So is that the key area of disagreement or parting company with the plan?
That's the key physical area of concern.
Okay.
Beyond that is that there's a lot of things that have been said, like that there's not going to be any land sales, that development will only be done to the extent necessary for Fort Monroe to pay its own way, that aren't actually in, when you look at the plan, those aren't actually written down in the plan.
So you would like to see
words.
those sort of codified, clarified, and committed to.
And finalized,
if possible. All right, fair enough. As you look at this, Bill Armbruster, let's talk first about that Wary area, because that does seem to be the primary area where there's concern.
Let me just comment on the word development. That seems to be what scares a lot of folks. But let me point out there's been 400 years of development at Old Point Comfort and Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is 200 years old, but there's been a community out there for most of those 400 years. It is a living community now, and we want it to continue to be that. We look at models from previous BRAC installations. What is a good model for us? We look at the Presidio in San Francisco. We look at Governor's Island out there. They all have something to offer. But what we have down here is unique. It is a vibrant community, and we want it to be so. I think Williamsburg is a better model for us to look at in terms of marrying a community with the historic elements, and they've done a beautiful job. The difference is people. You need people. Otherwise, if you're going to create just a simple garden space or a park area, you're going to have another gated community, which means at 5 o'clock, the tourists go home, You lock the gate and you have a park.
So what does the reuse plan as it stands now, and I hear your concern about putting more, making that a green space, that area that we're talking about, that contested area, the Weary area.
That area is already a mixed use area. And,
okay.
And we have people
So what do you
there.
envision, what does the reuse plan envision for that area right now?
The reuse plan right now says the future of that area is undetermined in terms of the long-range use. Immediately for the next 10, 15, 20 years, we want it to continue to be a mixed use. If we're serious about
mixed use meaning
residents, service facilities, schools, office buildings, and that's what you've got there now.
Okay.
You've got a convenience store, you've got a gas station, you've got a bank, you've got a bowling center. If we're going to get tourists out there, you're going to need these facilities, and that's a perfect place to put them.
Kathy, my group doesn't oppose all development on Fort Monroe. For one thing, we want all the historic buildings reused with residents and businesses producing revenue to help make this place self-sustaining. And we are in support of any necessary additional new development to make it pay its way, carefully done in compliance with the strictest standards and great thought and care given to it. For example, the North Gate area, Bill proposes significant new development, and my group doesn't oppose that in concept. But the idea that because after World War II, the Army erected a bunch of 60s style bowling alley gas stations, that somehow is going to drive the future of Fort Monroe, I think is a big mistake. We have to try for the highest aspiration at Fort Monroe. Those post-World War II buildings will someday be cleared. Not immediately, because Bill says we need some of them for revenue, but they will be cleared. Let's not let what happened in the 60s dictate the vision for Fort Monroe. Let's decide what the very best use of the Weary Quarter is. The people want a grand public place at Fort Monroe.
And it sounds like the other piece that you're concerned about is that what might happen beyond that 10 years or so, that temporary period, what might happen beyond that time?
Absolutely. I mean, there's governors come and go, you know, Fort Monroe Federal Area Development members and will come and go, and we want to put something in place for the long term that will stand up to pressure.
That's our job. That's exactly what our role is. That's our mission, is to build that structure, that management entity, and for the future. I mean, that's what we're all about.
Because both of you who serve on the FADA now, is that correct? Both of you are, but you come to the meetings, right?
I come to every meeting I can get to.
He's a regular contributor. We're always happy to have Mark there. But let me also point out that the 5 management zones that are in the reuse plan are defined what the reuse will be in each of those areas, except the Weary Quarter. Now, a significant part of the Weary Quarter has already been identified to be green space. So we're only talking about the area that is currently a mixed use. The green space in the Weary Quarter includes the Officers Club and some of the batteries, but it is beautiful beachfront area out there.
And that, I think, is the fear, is that you have this beautiful beachfront area out there, and a lot of folk might like to get their hands on that.
That's true. That's true. But you've already got housing out there. I could envision possibly a resort-type hotel, a small, like a Sanderling hotel that's down in the Outer Banks. That fits in the character of that place. Yes, there was new development in the Weary Quarter after World War II, but there's been development in that area since the beginning, 400 years ago. And that's the point I want to make. If you look at some of the old photographs, it was a major resort area, and you had the Chamberlain is a survivor of that era. But there were beautiful old hotels. That's where people came to enjoy the waterfront and a destination spot, and that's what we want it to be. We want it to become a destination, once again, to enjoy the beaches, the waterfront, hiking, biking, kayaking, all of those things that are there. It's a wonderful location to do that. We want to share it with everybody.
Kathy, our group paid for a study done by the Trust for Public Land, a national respected organization. They look specifically at public open space in the core of Hampton Roads, highlighting along the waterfront. And they compared us to other harbor cities, Boston, New York, and San Francisco, their core areas. And what they found, which is probably not surprising to any of your viewers, is that we had far less public open space in our core, especially along the waterfront. Fort Monroe was identified by the Trust as maybe one of the last great opportunities we have to start addressing that deficit, and to do it in a place of such visual interest and amenities through adaptive reuse of the old buildings and some carefully new development. We have the possibility, if we maximize the open space and get the hiking. You can't do hiking, you need some space to do some real hiking and do some of the things that Bill mentioned. So we really, and the people want this from all our work with the citizens in the last 3 years. They want to maximize the open space at Fort Monroe. And the beauty, one of the best things Bill Armbruster did when he came here, there was a lot of talk about it being $15 million a year to run Fort Monroe, which suggested maybe we got to build a lot of things. Well, Bill got a professional economist in here who knew what he was talking about to look at the economics, and they found it was far less than $15 million a year. It was more like $5 million a year. That makes the vision, the highest vision possible, because we don't have to do but so much reuse and development to make this thing work. In other words, we have the possibility of a win-win where we can get that grand public place and be able to pay for it without hitting the taxpayer.
We invited the Trust for Public Land to make their presentation, and certainly agree that there's a need for more open space and access to the waterfront. And we believe our plan meets that. Over 40% of the 570 acres that comprise Fort Monroe will be open space available. All of that beach area is going to be available. There will be no closed areas out there. There's not going to be any gated community. We want the public to use every bit of it. Mill Creek, the 2.5 miles of beach area out there, that's all going to be open. We have committed to that. And we have something called the Programmatic Agreement that is being finalized, and that will govern what we can build out there, what we can do in the way of reuse and redevelopment. And this
you'll develop that and then it gets approved by somebody, or?
That provides limitations. For example, there's a height limitation on building out there. We'll be able to build nothing higher.
And so this goes to the filling in the blanks that you were talking about, Mark, the idea that it's important to fill in and clarify some of these things. So
and Mark's group were a part of this programmatic agreement as well. So that's going to help us define what we're going to do out there. It's going to limit the height, so there's not going to be any high-rises. It's not going to be in condos out there. It's going to be 2.5 to 3 stories max. That's all we're allowed to do. We're going to focus on adaptively reusing the historic structures that we have. That's the key to the success out there. But where we are going to do some new development, and there will be new development, it will be sympathetic to the architectural character out there, to the historic fabric of what is Old Point Comfort, Fort Monroe.
One of the elements of that historic fabric, and Lisa Godley talked about it in the context of her report, and I think it's something that your organization really brought to the fore, which is this role of Fort Monroe as a site to talk about slavery in America. Is that envisioned to be part of this process?
Absolutely. In fact, we're beginning to work on something we're calling the Interpretive Master Plan. And we have engaged some consultants to help us research the contraband story. And that will be an integral part of the story that we're going to tell at Fort Monroe. It is a compelling story. It's one most of us did not learn when we were taking history growing up. I certainly didn't know about it, but slavery actually began at Old Point Comfort in 1619, and in 1862 with the contraband event. That was the beginning of the end. So it is a compelling story that is going to have a major role in the future telling of what the historical base is, Fort Monroe.
We call it the freedom story, and it's one of the great stories, and it happened right here in Hampton Roads at Fort Monroe. And it could, provided we make the place reach its full physical potential and make Fort Monroe really an international destination. And I think that's why we're striving so hard to make sure that we have just the best possible physical vision for Fort Monroe, that it will, by telling that story and other things, it will be a real economic engine for Hampton and Fort Monroe and for the region. And I cite as an example of strong stewardship. 1931, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, adopted the first and the strongest historic preservation ordinance that's ever been adopted in the United States, and they have, through fight after fight, maintained that for 70 years. We have something, and Charleston today, as everyone knows, is just stunning,
yes,
and a tremendous economic engine. We have here in the heart of Hampton Roads, a mile from I-64, something like that, something different, that if we do the very best planning and stewardship, we can have that economic engine here.
Well, there will be lots of conversations to have between now and 2011, and I thank both of you for being with us. And we'll have some links on our website where you can learn more about this grand public place. And boy, do we all agree that that needs to be the case.
And I would invite your viewers to access our website.
Right, and we'll have both of the websites on our website. We'll all be on the websites.
Okay.
And I'll be back in a moment with a final thought. It was former Governor Doug Wilder who was inspired by the idea of a U.S. slavery museum to document that sad chapter in our history. He started talking about it in 1992. Groundbreaking was in Fredericksburg in 2001, and it was supposed to have opened nearly 2 years ago. But for now, there is no museum. There is just a stone sculpture and a fence. A very nice stone sculpture, but that's all there is. And this may be one of those moments where a delay creates an opportunity to do the right thing. While many sites in Virginia and across the South could probably tell the story of slavery, few can do it as credibly as Fort Monroe. And more importantly, a Fort Monroe site could be up and running long before 2015, when we are told the Smithsonian will open its $500 million National Museum of African American History and Culture. You heard the timeline of the slavery connection just a moment ago in this broadcast. 1619, a British privateer lands 20 Africans at Old Point Comfort. The labor of their descendants builds Fort Monroe. 1861, 3 slaves escape by boat from Norfolk and ask for asylum at Fort Monroe. The Union commander shelters them and describes them as contrabands of war. Thousands follow. Scott Butler with Citizens for Fort Monroe National Park writes that the history of Fort Monroe and Old Point Comfort encapsulates the history of American slavery, from its very beginning to the beginning of its end. And so maybe it's time to sit down with Governor Wilder and ask whether that $50 million that's slated for Fredericksburg, already in the bank, might be better spent at Fort Monroe, with its many historically significant buildings already adapted for public use. The story of slavery extends beyond the Emancipation Proclamation and into the city that is home to Fort Monroe. It's a story of culture, education, courage, and perseverance. Here is hoping that Governor Kane, representing the Commonwealth, to which the Army will hand over Fort Monroe in 2011, will sit down soon with his predecessor to talk about Fort Monroe as the place for the U.S. Museum on Slavery. And unlike others who have commented on this issue, I think there is still room for the Smithsonian's efforts, scheduled to be open in 2015. One will not diminish the other. In fact, they're quite complementary. But 2015 is a long time off, and this economy will have a lot to say about whether the Smithsonian project will actually be on time. Fort Monroe's time is now, and it's time to put the value of the story above the politics of parochialism. Well, that's it for this edition of What Matters. Here is a look at what we have coming up in the weeks to come. Next week, we will take a look at an innovative program that Granby High School has underway that's helping teens lose weight and get in shape. This is an amazing story, and it's one that's taking place at Granby, and it's in fact taking place at some other schools throughout the region. It's an opportunity to actually take a look at exercise as a lifestyle strategy. And we know that that may be the key to many of the issues that affect our young people today, particularly when it comes to increasing rates of obesity. So we'll take you to Granby High School. We'll take you all over the region next week to talk about ways in which phys ed departments are taking a really unique look at how to keep weight under control and how to keep kids active for life. And in the case of Granby, here's a shock for you. It didn't come out of the phys ed department. It came from an art teacher. How about that? We have some great shows in the works for you, and we'll be glad to send you an e-bit to let you know what else is coming up. You can sign up at our website, whatmatters.tv, and that's where we'll have the links to matters of interest in tonight's broadcast. You can visit us on Facebook or email us at whatmatters@whro.org. You can also write to us at 5200 Hampton Boulevard, Norfolk, Virginia, 23508, or call us at 889-9425. Any way you choose, we are always glad to hear from you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week for another look at What Matters.